It is John Locke who theorized the liberal solution in his treatise on tolerance, published in 1689. Catholics can be tolerated if they renounce any political support of the Pope or of any power outside England. This is how Locke formulated the key tenet of the liberal theory of the nation state. The liberal notion of the nation state turned majority and minority into permanent political identities. Only the majority has sovereignty. The minority must not participate in sovereignty. The notion of a sovereign majority alongside non-sovereign minorities, in my view, was the original sin of liberal political theory. In Neither Settler Nor Native, I explore the export of the notion of different kinds of citizens, sovereign and non-sovereign, from the US to South Africa and Nazi Germany, and finally to Israel. At the same time, the book explores the construction of an epistemological project that grounded the political distinction between sovereign and non-sovereign subjects in a legal distinction. Beginning with religious groups, this distinction was extended to a civilizational one between races and tribes. I explore this development in some detail in the chapter on Sudan. Neither Settler Nor Native is a book about the United States as a founding experience in modern colonialism. The first chapter explores the Indian reservation as the site where core institutions of modern colonialism were forged. It is also a book about extreme violence as a consequence of modern nation-state building in the post-colonies. Should we think of extreme violence as the consequence of a criminal project executed by individuals, no matter how numerous, along lines of the criminal model popularized by Nuremberg and today upheld by the ICC? Or should we think of it as a political project, a notion born of the transition from apartheid in South Africa? What can we learn from the failure of denazification and the relative success of post-apartheid South Africa? Finally, the book asks, what is transportable in the South African experience? What does South Africa have to teach us? To answer this question, the last chapter takes a fresh look, a look through South African lenses at Israel-Palestine, likely the most intractable political problem in today's world. Now, in this talk, I'd like to comment on 4 issues. First, by taking the US as a case, as really a founding case in this book, I will compare the colonial conquest of Indians and the racial domination of Africans to distinguish between colonial conquest and racial domination as 2 different ways of subjugation, each with a radically different consequence. Second, I ask, what is the difference between an immigrant and a settler? Third, I suggest we think of 2 different ways of thinking of political identity, as political and changing, as opposed to as natural and unchanging. To historicize identity is to see it as born of a particular form of the state and therefore is changeable. But to see it as the ground for a natural and permanent claim is to think of identity as a timeless expression of a trans-historical and innate cultural self. Finally, I suggest that we decouple the nation and the state as we seek an alternative to the nation state. Let me begin with American Indians and African Americans. How should we call the pre-Columbian resident communities of the Americas? As Indian or as native? What's in a name? Indian is the name Columbus gave peoples of the New World. Today, we consider native a more politically correct designation. Yet neither the people in question nor the US government accept this designation. The museum in Washington, D.C., dedicated to pre-Columbian civilizations in the Americas, is called the Museum of the American Indian. What difference would it make if we were to call it the Museum of the Native American? Why is it that the 1964 Civil Rights Act in the US did not apply to Indians in reservations, so that a separate Indian Civil Rights Act had to be passed in 1968? To be sure, the two acts are not the same. The 1964 Act is constitutionally binding, whereas the 1968 Indian Act is not. It's only advisory. Reservation Indians are not and never have been rights-bearing citizens of the US in a constitutional sense. There were no reservations before the United States. The reservation was a creation of the United States. Though the reservation is geographically within the territory of the US, it is a polity separate from the United States. The Europeans who came to America were not immigrants, they were settlers. What is the difference? Whether they seek equality or advantage, immigrants come to join existing polities. Settlers come to displace existing polities and establish their own exclusive sovereignty. Indian reservations are not part of the sovereign state we call the United States. In the words of Chief Justice John Marshall in mid-19th century, reservations are domestic dependent colonies. The term Indian tribal sovereignty, another politically correct phrase, masks this reality of colonial domination. Legally, reservation Indians are wards of Congress. Reservation authorities are overseen by a vast federal bureaucracy known as the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The BIA is no different from the colonial bureaucracy that governed any indirect rule colony in Africa. The Indian reservation is part of a two-state solution. The two-state solution, a sovereign state alongside a non-sovereign protectorate, was Lincoln's contribution in the second half of the 19th century. Lincoln claimed to provide a permanent solution for Indians who had survived the genocide. Germany also embraced a two-state solution after Nuremberg. Instead of reintegrating Jews as equal citizens in a single state, as part of a one-state solution, post-Holocaust Germany embraced the idea of a separate state for Jews. As a result, even if the Nazi project was defeated militarily, it survived politically. The two-state solution gave the Nazi project a longer political lease. The latest version of the two-state solution, as we all know, is in Israel-Palestine. In contrast to South Africa, where the population was subordinated, majority of the population in Israel was expelled outside its boundaries, as it had been in the US when Indians were herded into reservations. America also originated the notion of differentiated citizenship, with only some participating in sovereignty. Until 1921, Indians were nationals but not citizens. After that, Indians had first to be purged as members of Indian polities before they could be naturalized as US citizens. Colonized Indians and African slaves represent two different colonial solutions. Both were turned into minorities, one inside the state, the other outside it. One was sustained by colonial conquest, the other by racial domination. The consequences have been radically different. Racial and colonial domination are not the same, even if racial discrimination is common to both. Reservation Indians have a different relationship to the US from that of African Americans. Colonization refers to conquest of territory. The American Indian symbolized land which has been stolen. The African slave embodied captive and coerced labor. The one-state solution provided a political frame for the development of the struggle against Jim Crow and racial domination. Even if it proceeded by fits and starts, even receding at times, the one-state framework both underlined the necessity of developing alliances and made it possible. The two-state solution explains both the continued isolation of the reservation Indian through colonization and their ongoing fragmentation as a people. The radical difference in the political effect of each solution is clear from the American case. The one-state solution has provided a political context for alliance building in a general emancipatory struggle. In contrast, a two-state solution has imposed isolation on an oppressed group by imposing on it a separate political home, a protectorate, and compounded that isolation with ongoing fragmentation in multiple reservations. I conclude that the one-state solution is politically preferable to a two-state solution. The American model was exported to a number of places, among these South Africa, Germany, and Israel. South African settlers attained state independence in 1910. A delegation visited North America, USA, and Canada 2 years later to study how Indians were governed. Three key elements of governance were imported to South Africa: homeland, traditional authority, and customary law. The starting fiction was that every tribe has from time immemorial lived in a territorially contained homeland. The fiction of a homeland in reality masked a program to expel each tribe from the bulk of its historical lands. Second, every homeland was said to have been administered by a traditional authority, also said to be from time immemorial. Eternally sanctioned by custom, this authority was said to be customary, not elected. Third, this traditional authority claimed the right to enforce a customary law on the homeland. Custom, too, was said to have been there from time immemorial. This time, though, settlers insisted that custom be excised of all practices or notions that settlers considered repugnant to civilization. I will return to discussing the lessons of the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa after a discussion of Germany and Israel. South Africa was not the only one that learned from the US. So did Nazi Germany and Hitler. Hitler drew two lessons from the US. The first was that genocide is doable and therefore thinkable. The second was that it's possible to create a second and a third class citizenship, as of African Americans, Indian citizens after 1921, later Puerto Ricans in the US. Hitler appointed a committee of lawyers to study American citizenship laws. This background preparation led to the drafting of Nuremberg Laws. The learning process has been documented by James Q. Whitman of Yale University in his book, Hitler's American Model. I argued that post-war denazification failed because the Allies shut their eyes to the political project that inspired and propelled Nazism. Nazism was a striving for a purified nation state, one that would go beyond distinguishing the national majority from national minorities to purifying the state by expunging all minorities. Not a liberal notion of the nation state, but and non-liberal notion, as with Iberia. After the Second World War, there was an American debate on Nazism. Was Germany liberated or occupied? Was Nazism a state project or a social project? Who should be held responsible for Nazism, the nation or the state? Nazi leaders or the German people? The American consensus was that the responsibility for Nazism lay with the German people. At Nuremberg and after, millions were considered criminally culpable, though each one individually. Yet Nazism was never probed as a political project. A similar debate unfolded inside Germany, particularly among German left intellectuals, the most prominent being Franz Neumann and Herbert Marcuse. Neumann wrote Behemoth, a book that dissected National Socialism. His answer? Nazism was neither just a state project nor just a project of German society. Nazism was rather a nation-state project, a project of both the German or both the Nazi state and the nation, the folk, to eradicate the presence of national minorities, Jews, Roma, and others, from state territory. From this point of view, Nazism was above all a political project. Denazification would thus require an alliance of all anti-Nazi forces, external and internal, the allies in those sections of German society that had resisted Nazism. But Americans were unwilling to do so. Only the Soviets were willing in the East, but only temporarily, not after the Berlin Uprising. I argue that Nuremberg failed to root out Nazism politically. To understand why, I distinguish the criminal model, which understands violence as the result of antisocial acts of individual perpetrators, from the political model, which sees extreme violence as the result of group mobilization around a collective nation-state project. Rather than individualize the violence as a standalone act, I point to cycles of violence sustained by groups mobilized as so many constituencies. Rather than catalog atrocities so as to name, shame, and punish individual perpetrators, I seek to identify the issues around which constituencies were mobilized. More importantly, rather than exclude perpetrators from the political process, I seek to include them, along with all those who survived, victims, perpetrators, beneficiaries, bystanders. I use the term survivor differently from how it was used after the Holocaust or after the Rwandan genocide, not just to refer to surviving victims of extreme violence, but to all those who survived the catastrophe we know as extreme violence. The point is to try and stop the cycle of violence by shifting attention from perpetrators to the issues that drive the violence. Let me return to the nation-state project and its development from a non-liberal to a liberal mode. As I've already suggested, political liberalism unfolded as part of a counterinsurgency project, not only in Europe after Westphalia, but also in the colonies. Neither settler nor native pursues this line of inquiry as part of a detailed case study of race and tribe making in Sudan after its colonization by Britain. The late 19th century Mahdiya in the Sudan was one of three events that shook the foundations of the British Empire between mid and end 19th century. The others were the Indian Uprising of 1857 and the Morant Bay Rebellion in the West Indies a decade later. The subsequent imperial reform was led by Henry Maine, a member of the Viceroy's Legal Commission in India, who argued that the Indian Uprising was the result of, quote, an epistemic defect. Maine called for an epistemic rethink that would both anchor the colonial project in a reshaped custom and fracture the colonized into smaller groups, each claiming a longer and thus authentic history. I examined this project in the context of Britain's reformed governance as it unfolded in two steps following the imperial defeat of the Mahdiya. The first step divided the population into two major blocks, each defined as a separate race, one called Arab, the other called African. In Sudan, the language of race begins with colonialism. The second step was to divide each race into several, quote, tribes. Even if tribe may previously have designated a distinct cultural group, an ethnic group in the language of anthropologists, it now became the basis of several connected claims: a separate homeland, a traditional authority, and a customary law that it enforced. The Sudanese anti-colonial movement embraced these claims as if they were natural. The anti-colonial movement needs to be understood as more a derivative than a creative act. From the start, the anti-colonial movement presented itself as a national movement, embracing the language of nation. Anti-colonialists described their struggle as nationalist, their object being to set up their own nation through an act of national self-determination. The question thus arose: who was the nation? The self in self-determination. Was the nation Arab, Islamic, or African? These three definitions of the nation sum up the three phases in the nationalist movement that followed state independence in 1954. The person who came closest to breaking through the nationalist mythology was John Garang, who argued that Sudan was both Arab and African, that Arabic was a language and Africa was a place. You could thus be both African and Arab. He called for a new Sudan, a state that would acknowledge Arabs and Africans as among its citizens. Garang's political project seemed to die with Garang when he was murdered. Those who replaced him in the SPLA called for the division of Sudan into two homelands, one for Arabs, the other for Africans. Backed up by a coalition of Western states led by the Troika, comprising the US, Britain, and Norway, the project gave birth to an independent South Sudan, which in no time disintegrated as different tribal militias fought over the spoils, which included cabinet positions, ministries, even districts, each claiming the right to its own homeland. In a South Sudan, there should rightfully be a federation of tribes. In less than 2 years, the tribal coalition fell apart, and a tribal war followed in 2013. Faced with this unanticipated catastrophe in the short aftermath of a much celebrated independence, the African Union set up an independent 5-person commission of inquiry. The commission produced 2 reports. The majority report reproduced the logic of Nuremberg and cozied up to the ICC. It denounced the violence as criminal and demanded that individuals be held responsible for it. As always with the discourse on criminal justice, the assumption was that the state cannot commit a crime. Only individuals in the state can. I authored the minority report and suggested we think of the violence as political, and thus look for a solution by calling for the reform of the state based on a project other than that of creating a nation state. I come to Israel and the US. Are Jewish people in Israel settlers or immigrants? The Jewish population of Mandate Palestine belonged to 3 groups. First were those who had never left. They were among the natives of Palestine. Second were those who returned to the Holy Land on a pilgrimage seeking a religious homeland. They were content to be part of the existing polity. This group were known as the First Aliyah. They were immigrants. Then followed those in the second and the third Aliyahs. They looked to create their own exclusive polity, a Jewish nation state in place of the existing polity. These are the settlers. The Zionists drew a lesson from Germany. Victim of the nation-state project in Germany and in Europe, Zionists decided to set up a nation-state in Eretz Israel. The Zionist state project unfolded in two phases. The first reduced Palestinians from a majority to a minority. This catastrophic expulsion is known as the Nakba. The Zionist project has continued to demonize the minority that remained within its territorial boundaries as a demographic threat whose numbers must be cut down. In other words, the Nakba continues. Palestinians inside Israel do not participate in sovereignty. They have rights, even political rights, including the right to vote, but they do not participate in power. This vision has become clearer as the state project has been redefined, from Israel as a Jewish and democratic state to Israel as a Jewish state. In this context, Palestinians face two options. A one-state solution where they face a racial exclusion, including political marginalization, but within the same state. In contrast, the two-state solution would create a protectorate and lead to indirect colonialism under Zionist rule. Neither settler nor native argues that a one-state solution will provide a better framework for building alliances for a durable resistance. Second, I argue that resistance is not enough. One also needs the vision of a different future. I propose that we look at the South African transition from apartheid for a glimpse of a third alternative. A different vision emerged in South Africa in the 1970s. Before the 1970s, anti-apartheid politics was largely derivative. By uncritically embracing the architecture of apartheid, the resistance reproduced it. Each racial group organized separately, as defined by apartheid power. Africans as ANC, Indians as Indian Congress of Natal, coloreds as Colored People's Congress, and whites as Congress of Democrats. Apartheid's ideological hold was not broken until the 1970s. The key initiative came from the student movement, white and black. The starting point was after black students under Biko left the liberal white student organization, formed their own separate body, and went on to organize township dwellers, starting with Soweto. Radical white students left in the wilderness turned to organizing hostel workers on the fringes of these same townships. The turning point in anti-apartheid politics was not the armed struggle, but the strikes that began in Durban in 1973 and the community uprising in Soweto in 1976. The Soweto uprising unfolded under the banner of Black consciousness. Biko said, "Black is not a color. If you're oppressed, you're black." The important thing is to recognize that there was nothing inevitable about the impact of Black consciousness on the anti-apartheid struggle. BC, Black consciousness, could have led to a nation-state consciousness, claiming that South Africa is a Black nation of the Black majority, thus essentializing Black as a trans-historical identity. Instead, it led to an epistemological awakening, the consciousness of Black as a historical political identity. Afrikaners made a journey from being junior partners of British colonialism to being part of the anti-apartheid coalition. Even here, there was no consensus. The rift inside the Afrikaner community was demonstrated by the publication of a book authored by Rian Malan, the great-grandson of a Boer state president. The book was called My Traitor's Heart. Malan was a crime reporter for the Johannesburg Star. His beat covered black townships. Each chapter of his book focused on a specific type of what was then called black-on-black violence. One chapter was devoted to the Hammerman, a big black man who wielded a heavy hammer to smash the skull of his victims, all equally black, but all poor who would yield small pittances. Malan's subtext was not difficult to decipher. If they can do this to their own, what will they do to us, meaning to whites, if given half a chance? The South African movement was born in the 70s and 80s. This birth was marked by a threefold shift in vision. First, from opposition to apartheid, they looked for an alternative to apartheid. Rather than being content with turning the world upside down, they dared to think of a different world. From a state of the majority, the national majority, the black majority, the resistance began looking to create a state of all the people. From opposition to whites, the resistance went on to oppose not whites, but white power. I suggest we think of 1994 as marking the birth of a new political community. The alternative would have been to rupture the existing community into two separate ones, as in Sudan, one for victims, the other for perpetrators, one for blacks, the other for whites, requiring a partition of South Africa as of South Sudan. Let us not forget that in 1994, Afrikaners were divided about the future. In fact, a minority asked for a homeland where Afrikaners would have their own state. The anti-apartheid movement chose a different future, a common future for survivors of apartheid, who they often described as a rainbow. Not just victims who survived, but all who survived, whether victims, perpetrators, beneficiaries, or bystanders. The principal critique of 1994 is that there was no social justice. This critique both states a truism and misses the significance of the political rebirth that was 1994. I argue that we should see the rebirth as the beginning of political decolonization. The turning point was the reformulation of the central demand from black majority rule to non-racial rule. Rather than deny the existence of race as phenotypical difference, the anti-apartheid movement refused to endow racial difference with a political significance. Excuse me. It's water. The first step to decolonizing the political was deracialization. The next step would be detribalization. Rather than deny the cultural significance of tribe as an ethnic group, detribalization would decouple the link forged under colonialism between culture and territory, ethnicity and homeland. To do so would reverse the process whereby colonialism and apartheid, excuse me, whereby colonialism and apartheid politicize culture through the creation of homelands, where a homeland authority would enforce a customary law. The result would be a single citizenship, not multiple citizenships based on separate identifications, race in the central state and tribe in the homelands. 1994 created formal political equality in South Africa, regardless of race, but it has yet to create formal political equality in the former homelands, regardless of ethnic identity. My claim is that a successful struggle for social justice will need to cut across the political divide imposed by race and tribe. Without political equality, the mobilization for social justice will be fragmented into so many separate mobilizations of races and tribes. It will more likely lead to an internal civil war. The result will stink, like the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, or its mini version, the ongoing xenophobic violence in South Africa. At the core of political Zionism is a political project to build not just a Jewish religious community in the Holy Land, but a Jewish state. Political Zionism seeks to erase the distinction between state and society. The conflation of society with the state is the foundation of the nation state and its program of rule by a permanent national majority. The nation state may call itself a democracy, as Israel does, but this majority is not actually determined through political contestation. Rather, the majority is defined pre-politically, as in the nation. The most the majority can hope for is a democracy for the majority, but not for all. But even majoritarian democracy remains a difficult project in Israel because the state defines who can be a member of that majority. In other words, who is officially recognized as a Jew. And what does it mean to be a Jew? If Israel is to be a state for Jews only, it must answer the question of who is a Jew. Its answer cannot avoid flattening the diversity of world Jewry into the Jewry sanctioned by the state. At the legal level, this question has bedeviled Israeli authorities since the law of return was passed in 1950. Is a Jew defined by religion or by ethnicity, or both? The state of Israel now has two legal definitions of who is a Jew. The narrow definition provided by halacha, religious law, which Israel enforces in the sphere of personal affairs, and the broad definition in the amended law of return. At the political and social level, Judaization eliminates unacceptable forms of Jewishness. The acceptable form is associated with Ashkenazim, European Jews who trace their lineage to Yiddish-speaking parts of Europe. Ashkenazim were the founders of the state, who claimed to be civilizers committed to bringing other Jews into line with the national ideal. In particular, Ashkenazim have sought to civilize Mizrahim. The Mizrahim are Arab Jews. They present a special challenge to Zionism, for Zionism presumes that Arab and Jewish identity are both incompatible and indelibly hostile towards one another. Otherwise, there would be no need of a Jewish state in historic Palestine. Ashkenazi Israel has demanded of the Mizrahim that they renounce their Arab culture and embrace only their religion, Judaism. After several decades, the Mizrahim have paid back by standing behind a stark religious Zionism that has two targets, the Ashkenazim and the Palestinians. In the Zionist worldview, Palestinians are Canaanites who never left home. They are squatters, not natives. The Zionist demand is that after the Holocaust, the squatter must make room for the returning native and get out of the way. The development of a Palestinian consciousness straddling these three groups has been an outcome of a protracted process whose focus and center of gravity have shifted radically over time. From exile to home and from an all or nothing demand for Israel's disintegration to a demand for involvement in the Israeli political process. Organizationally, this has involved a threefold transition. At first, displaced Palestinians looked for Arab frontline states to be their protectors and liberators. After these Arab states were defeated in 1967, Palestinians turned to the nascent and exile-led PLO, an armed resistance movement. In 1982, Israel went to war in Lebanon, the brainchild of Ariel Sharon, then the defense minister. This was a total war against Palestinians. The IDF deployed well over 120,000 troops for over 10 weeks. It was the country's largest mobilization since the 1973 war, according to Rashid Khalidi, leading Palestinian historian. Outgunned and overwhelmed, the PLO withdrew to Tunis. Even if the PLO was defeated, Sharon's strategic objective remained unrealized. Instead, the war intended to suppress Palestinian nationalism only stoked it further. With the exiled armed resistance smashed, the moment was ripe for political mobilization at home. The first Intifada uprising in the late 1980s crystallized the internationalization or internalization of Palestinian leadership, and with it a definitive rejection of the failed armed resistance championed by the external leadership with a mainly refugee base. The second Intifada, beginning in 2000, brought together Palestinians in Israel and the occupied territories under a single movement. Both intifadas responded to the failings of the official Palestinian liberation movement. The second intifada in particular reflected frustration over the PLO's capitulation to Zionism at the Oslo Accords of 1993 and the onward rush of settlements that followed. Arafat made two compromises at Oslo. First, he tacitly accepted settlements in the West Bank. Second, he explicitly accepted Israel's stranglehold over the economy and sovereignty of the occupied territories, even going so far as to agree that this stranglehold would persist in a future Palestinian state. The success of the Second Intifada led to mobilization under Balad, National Democratic Alliance, a political party led at the time by Azmi Bishara, a Palestinian member of the Knesset. Bishara and Balad's contribution can be summed up in two bills he introduced in the Knesset over the years. The first was a new basic law calling for collective rights and complete civic equality, but not political equality, of the minority and the majority. This first bill was still within the framework of a nation-state politics, accepting the distinction between the majority nation and its minorities. The second bill went a step further. It asked the Knesset to affirm that Israel is, quote, a state of all its citizens, whereas Bishara's first bill sought equal rights for the national minority. Now he was asking the Knesset explicitly to reject the idea that Israel is a nation state, a state of the Jewish people, thereby negating the existence of both the national minority and the national majority. Over the past decade, Palestinian politics has moved from an engagement predominantly internal to one predominantly external. The internal engagement called for a state of all its citizens as a counter to the Zionist project for a Jewish state. The external engagement takes the form of an international boycott of Israeli state and society under BDS. To the extent that BDS calls for the de-Zionization of the State of Israel, there is reason to give it full and enthusiastic support. But to the extent that BDS seeks to extend this boycott to Israeli society, and not just to its Zionist sectors, there is reason for caution. BDS needs to learn from the very experience it claims to build on, that of the South African divestment and boycott campaign during apartheid. As a participant in the anti-apartheid boycott, I came to realize that its key mistake was to collapse state, regime, and society into a seamless whole. The main problem with blanket boycotts is that they embrace a mirror image of the nation-state framework, which collapses state and society into one. By themselves, international boycotts are incomplete. The strategy of isolating the state internationally needs to be aligned with a domestic strategy to isolate the forces that stand behind the state project internally. to drive a wedge between pro-state forces in civil society and those not aligned to the state. For Palestinians and Israelis, both those anti-Zionist and non-Zionist, the South African struggle offers two lessons. In Israel, as in South Africa, this means overcoming two categories of divisions. The first is the division among victims of the nation state. In South Africa, the population was divided among township dwellers and Bantustan residents, a barrier overcome by a coalition of students and workers. The victimized population was also divided racially and tribally. The racial barrier was overcome by Black consciousness movement, while the tribal barrier remains. Among the Palestinians, there is a tripartite division of victims, those living in the diaspora, the occupied territories, and Israel proper. Each of these groups has been further differentiated. The diaspora includes those in the refugee camps and those beyond. Residents of the occupied territories are split between the West Bank and Gaza, and oppressed citizens of Israel include Arabs, Jews, and Bedouin. Each microgroup is subject to a different political regime, designed to produce a specific and separate subjectivity. The second phase in South Africa led to winning over a sizable number of apartheid supporters to the anti-apartheid cause. That may be harder in Israel. That said, we cannot forget that the ground shifted from under the apartheid state when Afrikaners, who provided most of the foot soldiers for apartheid's machinery of repression, opened up to an alternative to the apartheid order. The Afrikaner shift from the right of the political spectrum to its middle range shows that no political identity is permanent. What can BDS learn from the South African experience? First, whereas BDS can contribute to Israel's international isolation, something else is needed if a non-Zionist alternative is to bloom in Israel itself. Like in South Africa, that something else is an epistemic revolution that will open the way to a political one. The Palestinian moment will come when the resistance recognizes the complementarity of two seemingly different objectives: to unify the oppressed and to fragment their opposition so as to isolate core opponents. The goal should be to arrive at a point whereby it is not just the oppressed who seek political change, but also many of the current supporters of Zionist power. Getting there will require a new kind of political consciousness within Israel, a consciousness based on a double recognition. One, that there can be no military solution to the Palestine-Israel question, and two, that the flourishing of Jews and Jewish life does not require a Zionist state. Apartheid fell because of a confluence of two developments. The better known of these is the anti-apartheid uprising in the townships. The uprising brought diverse groups under a single umbrella. The result was not a victory, but a deadlock. Why then did the National Party choose to go to the negotiating table, to shift focus from a military to a political struggle? Because the NP realized that it was beginning to lose the support of important sections of the Boer intelligentsia, which were calling for a political solution to the problem of apartheid. The writing was on the wall. More and more of this intelligentsia were convinced that whites did not need to monopolize political power to have a home in South Africa. It is this lesson that needs to be driven home to Israelis, as many as possible. That Jews do not need to have a Jewish state to have a secure home in Israel-Palestine. Indeed, Jews are more secure in New York City than they are in Israel. The lesson for BDS is that they need to build on the gains made by Balad. To do so would be to provide a political home to anti-Zionist and even non-Zionist Jews in Israel. Thank you.